here today, and
recording started.
Pleasure to have both of you here at the Friday Institute. David Rose is the founder and chief education officer at CAS, a not-for-profit in the Boston area that focuses on universal design for learning. He's also on the faculty of the Harvard Educational School of Education, and for many years has made many important contributions to education and the use of technology, particularly for students who may be at the margin of traditional education systems. Okay, Chris Dede is professor in learning technologies at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, fellow of the American Educational Research Association, and has done lots of outstanding work on digital learning platforms, augmented reality, and scaling educational technology innovations. I'm sure many of you already know lots of Chris and David's work. We could spend a long time introducing each of them and all they've accomplished and all the awards they've won, but we'll simply hear from them rather than spend a lot of time doing that. And if we can begin, I have some initial questions we'll start out with, and again invite you to add others as we go. Since both Chris and David, you were both on the panel that developed the 2010 National Education Technology Plan for the U.S. Department of Education, I think that provides a good starting point, so we can start with 2010 and then look more to the future. So several related questions. We have had a webinar with Karen Cater, who talked about the National Ed Tech Plan. Some of the same folks may have participated, possibly new folks. So I'd like to ask, what do you consider to be some of the most important elements of the National Ed Tech Plan for moving forward? And I assume you really probably wrote it starting in 2009, so about 3 years ago. What progress have you seen over these past 3 years? And if you were reconvened to update the plan, are there things you would change or update? So what are some of the important elements? How much progress have you seen, and what would you like to see revised? Chris, would you like to start?
Sure, and I think probably each member of the 15-person technical working group might have a different answer to what they think the real important things in the plan are. It's very much a multidimensional document that doesn't hinge on one or two innovations. The two that come to my mind are that a 21st century learning system is life-wide. It's not limited to learning in the place of the classroom and the time of the school or university, but it's learning any place, any time, with supports from a wide variety of people for learning any place, any time. And in 2009, saying that there would be a pervasive mobile infrastructure in classrooms and out to support this was forward-looking, but today it's now commonplace. So we feel good about that part of it. The other thing that I would cite is the part of the plan on assessment that talks about measuring what matters, because too much of what we see in the high-stakes assessment today is measuring what's easy to measure rather than measuring what's important, and measuring that summatively after the learning has happened, when it's too late to improve the learning, rather than measuring it formatively and diagnostically so that you get feedback as you're going along. So life-wide and measuring what matters are two of the highlights for me. Maybe before we go on to the other pieces, David, you want to talk about the most important part?
Yeah, I agree with actually both of those. I would add, I liked it that the plan began really with the learning sciences education rather than technology. It was important for us, I think all of us, that driver be evident rather than that we begin with an accumulation of tools and talk about apps and things. So for me, that felt like the right kind of panel to be on, I have to say. There was I think an important consideration of, in addition to being life-wide, that it's population-wide, that there's a push for UDL within the plan, which I certainly liked, in a sense that the populations we're serving are very broad, and that understanding those individual differences is key. to both what technology can be good at and what we need as a country.
In terms of the sort of what might we add to the plan in 2012, or what's new in terms of the landscape, one of the things the plan talked about was that credentialing should be based on competency rather than based on seat time. That instead of knowing that a course is some number of weeks long and that's when you get some kind of recognition that you've completed the course, that its time might vary depending on how quickly any individual was able to move through that. And we now see some of that at least beginning to happen with these massively open online courses in which people are participating in a course that's seat time based, but their credentialing is not necessarily seat time based. It's just based on how well they can do on some sort of a measure that the course designers have created. And I think that move towards competency based, which was a vision in the plan but not happening much at the time, is an important development. I also think that this very webinar is an example of another thing the plan talks about that's become much more prevalent, which is connected teaching. The idea that teachers are connected in a rich web of resources that helps them to function more effectively. And of course, EPIC education is that kind of a resource and exemplifies connected teaching.
Anything else, David, on that?
I think one other thing that I would add, I think Chris is right about the assessment was a very important part. And the movement away from summative testing, which is easy to do, but isn't actionable, isn't helpful to education in general.
I wondered why the 36
I just called them. They got calls, so their servers.
I was wondering
On,
wasn't changing.
will we getting any?
Unlikely, at least.
Will we getting any? Folks, if anybody is out there, we've been told that the campus server is down, so we believe that everybody has been disconnected. If anybody
to check if they're on.
is out there,
There we go. They're on.
their people are on. Okay. Well, we're going to continue then. It looks like folks who are on are still on. Thank you for responding.
Yeah, lots of people.
It's always fun to use technology for these things. So we'll certainly continue. Apparently, we don't have as many people as we had hoped because the server is not allowing people to sign in and authenticate.
Oh, yeah, there's one. Folks cannot log in.
But we have a good group, so we're going to continue. I'm sorry, did I interrupt you, David?
I could tell everybody was looking distressed, and I was hoping it wasn't my answer.
At least we weren't on live TV. So sorry about that, everyone. We'll continue. David, go back.
Well, I was almost finished. That I think a lot more has changed in the field of measurement, and including looking at things that feel like slope rather than it feels like end states, and looking for measures and technologies that allow us to talk about progress monitoring and what the slope of the learning is rather than we've just reached a target. And I think those would be good. So technology can do better than most other things. But that's probably enough for now.
Okay, great. Another area that I know is mentioned in the National EdTech Plan that I've certainly been hearing a lot more about and hearing very different views of is this concept of personalized learning. And clearly, Chris, when you talk about competency-based learning, it's connected. If people are going to move on their own pace, they have to have more personalized opportunities. David, when you talk about measuring progress. Now, I've heard this used in different ways, in different contexts. Can you talk a little bit about your view of personalized learning and perhaps provide some examples of what it really looks like in practice?
Sure. I think perhaps I would say the thing that is I think, mistaken by a lot of people. And maybe that's my own point of view. We'll see how Chris feels. But that there's a feeling that the goal of the technology is to do that personalization. And we certainly know there are advantages to adaptive testing and things like that. But I have to say, from the brain standpoint, all learning is personalized. It doesn't happen except inside your brain. And effective learning is learning where the individual is active and engaged themselves. So when I think of personalized learning, it's not that the computer is smart and adapts to you. What the computer does is offer informed choices, and that you are, in fact, in charge of your learning. It's the only way it's really going to work. And that the personalization is done by you rather than the computer. But the computer is smart about likely choices, resources, opportunities, and then gives you the options of making choices that personalize it. And I think that personalization comes a little bit broader than people think. I think it's personalizing what your goals are. It's very important motivation to be able to do that. Personalizing the way that you get to those goals, and even personalizing the ways in which evaluation can be most appropriate in assessing for yourself. And lastly, I guess a personalization that's important is, in fact, that you get the feedback that you would find helpful in measuring your own progress. There's sometimes a little bit overemphasis on the technology measuring progress and keeping track in ways that aren't as informative to the individual as we need to do. And I think we need to get a lot better at that. So personalizing the way in which information comes to me so I can take action, change things that would make them better for me, so on. So lots of choices, feedback that's helpful in making good choices as I move forward.
Okay. Let me just take a moment to welcome those who just joined us and apologize. Apparently we had a bit of a technical problem and people were unable to sign on for a few minutes, but it looks like everything's back up and running. Chris, do you have some comments about personalized learning and what it looks like?
I do, and I'd like to build on what David said because I'm very much in agreement with that. A colleague, John Richards, and I co-edited a book called Digital Teaching Platforms that was published this past spring by Teachers College Press, that is about how you personalize learning in a group setting, like a classroom setting. And the heart of a digital teaching platform is not the technology, but students and teachers making decisions about personalization. So some of it is students having autonomy in deciding what kind of learning resources they're going to access, but also students don't always make wise choices, and so some of it is the teacher being able to look at how a student is doing and use his or her knowledge of what they might need next and moving forward with that. So I think that we're developing, through the learning sciences, as David was saying, some good ideas about how to build technology systems that don't take the teacher out of the loop in the way that a learning management system might be, but instead keep the teacher and the students at the heart of it, but provide a way of personalizing. The metaphor that John Richards and I talked about was that today's presentational classroom is much like a player piano, in which there's just sort of one tune that the teacher can play, and that a digital teaching platform begins as more like an orchestra, where the teacher is the conductor, but the students all can be doing different things and yet harmonizing together in that. And that ultimately where we want to go with personalization is more like the jazz combo, where now the students are improvising. They're not under the direction of a conductor, and yet the teacher might be the lead person in the jazz combo that sets the melody that the students are improvising around. So I think the technology can empower many kinds of teaching, good and bad. And the trick to empowering personalization is, as David said, to recognize that people can navigate to a niche within an ecology that suits them if you give them the opportunity to do that.
Great, thank you both. While we're already talking about things like personalized learning, competency-based learning, universal design for learning, learning sciences, lots of learnings there, use of technology to enhance teaching and learning. Certainly we all know that big wave right now in K-12 education is the implementation of the Common Core standards, and as people wait for the new student assessments being developed to go with those standards. Wondering how you see the intersection of the Common Core standards and new assessments with these other areas we've talked about. Do you see all this coming together and having synergy and helping move forward, or do you see these things somewhat in tension and conflict in terms of moving to the future?
I'll start, I guess. I think that the important thing about technology in relation to things like Common Core standards and assessment is that the technology, when used well, allows us more routes to success in reaching things like Common Core standards. And I happen to be a big fan of having Common Core standards, but making sure that we provide alternate paths to get there. And we're likely to have higher standards when we can allow, again, multiple options, multiple technologies, and so on to reach those standards. What I'm not a fan of is standardized testing as the mark of whether we've reached those standards. I think I'm probably preaching to the choir in this regard, but the typical previous kinds of standardized testings have so limited the kinds of cognition and affect and so on that we're measuring, that they're not a good predictor. I think everybody knows they're really good predictors of how you're going to do on the next test, and not very good predictors about how you're going to do in life or anything beyond that. So when it says assessment, I'm a fan of it, but I want, and Chris is much more an expert on this, I actually, though, would argue we want more assessment, much more assessment than we get. And I think games, the value of games is they show how addictive and powerful it can be when you have assessment that is ongoing, continuous, that's progress monitoring, rather than games would be terrible if you had to stop every once in a while and take a test to see if you'd learned how to play the game. So I'm an advocate of more assessment, and technology is terrific in the same way that it is at games, as giving many, many opportunities to assess that is much more authentic, and most importantly, to give feedback immediately rather than long after it's due. So standards, yes, like them, many different ways to get to them, and much more authentic and powerful ways of assessing. Timely assessments, actionable assessments. Sorry, one last point. The assessments should be directed both to the teachers' systems, but also to the students, so that much more information available to them to make good choices ahead.
Hey, Chris?
Well, to build on what David was saying, the standards and the assessments are rightly more demanding than the prior set of standards and assessments. And I think that's very important because we are now preparing this generation of students to compete in a global, knowledge-based, innovation-centered economy rather than, as when I grew up, to compete in a national industrial economy. The two skill sets are really different from one another, and the Common Core standards and some of the next generation assessments are at least partial steps in that direction. And if we had stayed with our older standards, I think that we would be in the position of the kids going to feel-good camp, you know, where you get an award just for waking up in the morning or still breathing at lunch. and then you come back home, and what have you actually gained from it? Well, not much of anything. But the standards and the assessments don't create the learning. They create the goal, but they don't create the learning. And so the big challenge is to understand how, not just for gifted and talented students, but for all students, we can meet standards that 10 or 20 years ago would only have been applied to gifted and talented students, only been applied to high-performing students. So that's a big shift and a very important challenge for us to meet. What I think is missing in the standards, interestingly enough, is what a lot of people are calling, and I really don't like this term, non-cognitive skills. I don't like the term, but it does refer to not the fact that it isn't simply your knowledge, content, and skills that determine your success in life or your success in school. It's a lot of other things. Your ability to use metacognition, your ability to self-regulate your activities, your ability to work well with others and collaborate, your motivation to do well in school, your self-efficacy and your belief in yourself that you can attain that. And I worry sometimes that even if we succeed on this generation of standards, if we graduate a set of students who hate learning and who never want to have to do anything with it again in their lives, that we've failed terribly. So I think the standards and assessments are a better goal than what we've had, but a lot of what the future involves is not simply attaining that goal, but attaining that goal in a way that people love the process and are energized by it and want to spend the rest of their lives after they graduate going beyond the standards.
Can I just
please
want to, Chris and I are unfortunately too much of the same beliefs in a lot of these things. I, too, am really annoyed with the non-cognitive word. It's very popular these days, and I think it really misjudges what we've learned from the neurosciences. It would be much more accurate from a neuroscience standpoint to consider the cognitive as the non-affective parts. The nervous system is a goal-directed system. It's not a cognitive, it's not an information processing system at its heart. It is a goal-directed, emotion centered system, and so I want to say that the present testing environments actually take out all the parts that Chris is talking. In fact, the best example of that is, I think a lot of people know the most famous neurological patient, Phineas Gage, who had the crowbar go up through his front of his head. The part of our brains that we most value and most differentiates us from all the primates, prefrontal cortex. So it blew the front off of his. What he didn't have was a drop in IQ, the testing part. He was unable to be effectively employed, to manage his social relationships, any of those things. But if you gave him a test that is a highly structured domain with clear answers to choose from, he was fine. So I think in that regard, when we use assessments that are actually using the parts of our brain that aren't needed when we're looking at how are we going to actually set goals for ourselves that are reasonable, self-regulate, persist when things are difficult, all of those things, which is what's going to make people successful, we're not assessing them. So I like unstructured domains for a lot of our assessments where kids are having to actually come up with good questions rather than good answers, all of those things. So I'm in 100% agreement with Chris in this area.
And to build on that again, many people will talk about that special teacher they had or those two special teachers they had that really changed their lives in a fundamental way. And although they typically describe a teacher who was very adept in terms of conveying content and conveying skills and managing the classroom, in fact, they also describe someone whose even bigger impact was on the emotional side, somebody that really cared about you, somebody that believed in you even when you didn't, somebody that was tough on you and helped you to aspire to something beyond what you thought you were capable of. And that whole dimension is largely missing. It's missing from technology, certainly, because technology, unlike people, is all cognitive. It's not affective at all. And it's missing largely from the standards. It's missing largely from methods courses. It's missing largely from professional development. And we've got to find a way to bring that dimension in more strongly, because the first instinct when you're confronted with a big jump in expectations is just to throw up your hands and say, this is beyond what I can do.
Great. Thank you both. For all the folks online, we still are looking for questions for Chris and David, unless I gather we're monitoring Twitter also. Please, the chat space or Twitter, or however you'd like to send them. Meanwhile, let me try to bring things down to a more concrete school-based level with a few questions. We've talked about lots of very important concepts, but are there places, whether they're projects, schools, districts, initiatives, where could people go and look and see things moving in the kind of directions you would like to see?
Well, Glenn, as you know, you and I were down in Mooresville, North Carolina recently as part of a special meeting that was convened by COSN to look at teaming for transformation and taking the model of one-to-one computing that had evolved in Mooresville, which is a rural, relatively small, not affluent district, and see if they could adapt that one-to-one model to their very different sets of circumstances, because the Mooresville students have made a lot of gains on both standard achievement measures and the kinds of things that David and I have described as perhaps more important. And at the same time, the one-to-one has been used for personalization, which is another big theme that we've talked about, and for life-wide learning, which ties back into the National Ed Tech Plan. So it was very interesting for me to interact with the leadership team in Mooresville and to get a sense of the kinds of strategies that they were using. And as with the other districts that came to be part of Teaming for Transformation, I think that if you're part of a district that is looking at a technology-intensive infrastructure, whether it's one-to-one or more than one-to-one, whether it's bring your own device or it's use some kind of laptop initiative, that Mooresville is an interesting place to consider. A second district at a very different scale that I think is quite interesting is Katy, Texas, which is a suburb to the west of Houston that for years has been doing a very large implementation of mobile devices. And this again is life-wide because they are mobile devices. They're in and out of the classroom. It's bring your own device, so that has created some logistical challenges for teachers, but at the same time it's made it very affordable. And again, I think there are wonderful things happening with teaching and learning that come out of not using the devices as a presentational delivery platform, but instead, in the spirit of the National Ed Tech Plan, using them as a vehicle for active learning and for formative assessment. And then quickly, a third district that I've worked with and am very impressed by is, again, quite a different district in Westchester County, New York, the Chappaqua School District, which has a school within a school that is very student-centered. It's for students who find a student-centered model of learning much more valuable for them than a content-centered model or a presentation-centered model. And the teachers who've chosen in the district to get involved with that school have a lot of freedom to try different teaching techniques. The students have a lot of freedom to indicate which parts of the curriculum are of greatest interest to them. And then, of course, the big challenge becomes preparing them for standards and preparing them for assessments when you aren't centering on the curriculum, but instead you're centering on the student. And technology, again, is playing a very interesting role. Some of the emerging technologies like virtual worlds or augmented realities that I built, we've been piloting in Chappaqua. So different size districts, different types of technology, different amounts of funding available, but overall, this focus on the themes in the National Ed Tech Plan.
Well, I'll just mention maybe one school district. My background's in universal design for learning and looking at technology as key in actualizing that. And a school district that we like to look at to learn from is Bartholomew Consolidated Schools in Columbus, Indiana. What I like and want to mention about it is that they don't think of having a technology program. They think about having a learning program which takes the principles of UDL as the core of how to make a strong learning program for all of their students. And then they look at how does technology allow them to do the things they want to do. So everything gets filtered through how does this help us become a better UDL-based school. And they're driven in that way toward learning and toward what we were calling personalization earlier, making sure that it works for everybody. And only then do they say, and now what technology would be helpful in getting us there? So I like that emphasis. At the other end, we're having a great time learning from Boston Tech in Boston, which is a very strong technical school in terms of understanding technologies. But they too are very learner and learning centric. They're not trying out technologies just because they're new or sexy, but they're very driven by performance of their students, and technology fits into that. Perhaps that's enough. I think anywhere where I see a dominating view of how do we make this a learning organization and fitting technology into that, those schools look good.
We have a specific follow-up question that just come in, which is asking whether you know of any schools or school systems that are bringing effective awareness to the center, especially in teacher professional development. You've both talked about the importance of those areas. Are there good examples out there that you know of you could point people to?
I'm sorry, say that again, the question?
The effective side.
Oh, affective.
Side.
Sorry, it's your Brooklyn accent.
My Brooklyn accent. That's an A, not an E.
Well, I'll just give an anecdote, Chris, maybe you, and allow me to mention other Chelmsford Public Schools near Boston, not a upscale town at all, and they are also a very strong UDL district. And we had a teacher come to an institute we had where she was teaching other teachers about doing universal design for learning. And she actually didn't use any technology to start. She taught us all how to make a salad. It was unbelievable. These are professional educators. Everybody got totally involved in it. And what she did was begin with affect entirely. She wanted to get us all, we were in a boarding institute, which I was very much a part of running, embarrassingly. She got everybody alive, awake, and engaged in thinking about learning by doing nothing except working on salads together. And affect drove everything she did, and she was just a remarkable teacher. And I think her ideas are now informing us. We like that. And I think her school system is putting more and more emphasis on how do we get kids engaged because we're making things that are valuable, important, what they do. Chris?
I'm not the best person to answer the question because it's not, although I think it's very important, it's not my primary area of work. And so I'd encourage any of you that have good answers to that question to please post them to the chat. But I think that the professional development that I've seen on collaboration often gets into the themes indirectly that we're talking about. because to be effective in collaboration, you need self-efficacy, you need the ability to do social perspective taking and think how the other person is thinking. You need engagement, you need to care about the outcome. So sometimes if a district might be wary about focusing on affect, having professional development about collaborative learning might be a way of bringing that in through the back door.
If I could just say amplify one thing that for the listener, that Google the term emotional design. It's a new term which is a marker of the changed view. Again, I like it because it isn't non-cognitive, Chris.
Yeah.
But emotional design is, I think, a field that's going to grow, and it means, in many cases, the technology part. But I think schools will increasingly see that emotional design is a large part of what we need to do. So check out that term. And another thing that I read recently that I just loved was describing the central thing that teachers do as emotional work. And that, as Chris had said earlier, that the hard part that teachers do and that teachers can do and our technology can't yet is the emotional work of understanding where each of their kids were, not just cognitively, but emotionally. Where are they as a learner? What is the kind of intervention I need to do? What are the ways that I need to be providing the supports and challenges that they need? So both of those terms, I think, seeing teachers, the core thing that teachers do is emotional work and emotional design as what we need to do to get learners. I think we all look when we walk through a high school. Chris is rewarding me with a M&M here. When we go through high schools, I don't think we notice that their cognition isn't as high as we'd like. What we do notice is they look so disaffected, so bored, so awful, that I think emotional design and emotional work are going to become much more preeminent in what our schools are doing.
Okay. Thank you both. We now have lots of questions coming in and about 20 minutes to go, so I'm going to try to group several of them that come in really from the teacher perspective. And I'll frame it broadly of looking for the advice each of you would give to current classroom teachers of what's most important for moving forward. But we had specific questions asking about how do we make sure that technology is used to support students' development of critical thinking. We had questions about engaging parents in supporting the use of technology, and in general in how teachers can use technology with teachers themselves still in the equation, and how teachers' roles are affected by the effective use of technology. So I'm giving you a broad range to talk about from the teacher perspective. What advice do you have? How would you address issues of critical learning, teacher use of technology, and the concerns about getting community and parent support? You can pick any of those.
So I have one thought, and this is something I've experienced myself. I'm relatively, I think to both Glenn and Chris, a Luddite in using technology in my own teaching, although I've been getting better. And I realized that I fell into a trap that teachers often do, which I felt embarrassed and horrified when I couldn't figure out what to do with my technology, and it would crash and so on. And in thinking about that and watching teachers who were novices and somewhat and very unsure of themselves in using technology in their classrooms, I began to think of it, and I use it that way now, as a terrific opportunity. So I think for the kinds of things Chris talked about, we don't need people who know the capitals of states and things anymore. We need people who are expert learners, because everything we know now is going to change over the next few decades, and the tools we use for thinking and discovery and inquiry are all going to change. So we need people who are ready to change all the time and are expert learners that can learn things quickly and rapidly. So getting expert learners, kids need to see expertise as learners. So they don't need teachers who know everything. They need teachers who can show them how to learn. So the best opportunity is when something goes wrong and the teacher doesn't know what to do, she says, here's what I do now. I'm going to do this to try to figure this out, or I'm going to ask you, who can in my classroom can help me get going here. Demonstration of what it means to be a learner, which is not that you know things, but that you know how to learn things. So first thing I'd say as a teacher is not to be afraid of the fact that you don't know how to use the technology well. What it does is give you a great opportunity to say, let me show you how I learn things. And that might mean I have you teach me, which would be fabulous.
I think one of the things that we see in our own research with technology is how it's changing the role of the teacher when it's done properly to orchestrating student learning. And the teacher, instead of standing at the front of the classroom, actually in really effective classrooms, you can't tell what part of the classroom is the front because it isn't presentation oriented. The teacher is constantly wandering around, helping students and guiding the overall interactions that are occurring. And in the Digital Teaching Platforms book that I referenced earlier, we talk about this. We talk about how in classrooms that have this kind of a sense of the teacher conducting the orchestra, that the teacher's skills are much more sort of recognizing complex learning patterns in a group of students doing active learning and then sorting out how to pour gasoline on that fire. And in the work that we do in augmented reality, which involves going out into the real world with mobile devices, and the mobile devices help to enhance the real world so that you can learn better from it, the teachers we're working with who are accustomed to doing standard field trips and who now are doing technology-enhanced field trips report that the same kind of thing is happening with them. That before it was, okay, everybody gather around and listen while I talk about this tree. And now instead, students are scattered all over an ecosystem. The technology is keeping them focused and on task and doing something that's relevant and using a kind of jigsaw pedagogy where each student learns something different and then they combine their knowledge. And the teacher is the orchestrator going around and helping that process take place in a very effective way. So what we hear from teachers is this is a much more fulfilling kind of teaching than giving the same lecture 5 times or dealing with a bunch of classroom management problems from kids who aren't engaged because they're passive, or having to be the center of attention because you're the only knowledge source in the room.
I'd like to extend that, I think, to parents, because that was one of your questions too. I saw just the simplest, brilliant thing. We're working with Sesame Street a little bit on extending out into preschool classrooms, and a teacher had her standard. Actually, she had a small iPad type thing from which she was teaching her lesson. And the kids were constructing ramps and things. And what she did was just took a picture and pressed send to the kids' parents. And what it created was a break in the wall between home and school, so that the parent already had a picture when the kid came home of what they'd done. And then the teacher could send just a little Twitter to say, here's something to talk about. Here's what the content, here's what we're after here. So the parent is guided in, these are the kinds of questions. These are the kinds of things to talk about with your kids, because parents sometimes, too, feel unprofessional, aren't sure what it is they should do. So I loved it. Say, here's what your kid made, and here's some things you might want to think about when you talk to them about it. And I love it, the idea of the kid coming home and the parent says, wow, I saw you made this big ramp. Now, how did you know how to control the speed of this, or whatever? So I think one of the roles technology can do is bring parents into the classroom in productive ways where they feel their kids' growth, too.
I love that, too. And, of course, every parent has experienced the kid comes home and you say, what did you do at school today? Well, nothing. Yeah. So if you don't get that picture, you don't have the lever to start to open up the dialogue.
Yeah. And it's not bad to give parents some suggestions on how to begin that dialogue. Here it is, something to talk about, and we've done some work with parents reading digital books online, where there's a little button that is just essentially says, if you want some questions that you might talk about with this book, and then they draw out in the way that research has shown us how to talk about a book. So you're building vocabulary, you're building reading strategies, and so on. So digital is great in that way that you can literally have a parent button.
Okay. Thank you both. Let me move on. We have lots of questions coming in, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. Related to the prior question, from reading the questions, there are a number of educators out there who are saying we're really trying to keep up with all this. But boy, it's hard. You know, we're in the classroom, we're in the school, there's all these conferences, articles, webinars, and everything. And so there are a couple of questions asking, are there frameworks? Someone mentions TPACK. Are there ways that you would recommend that we keep up with all that's changing in a manageable way? I know we all struggle with this. There may be no answers.
One of the things that I do, and it's been actually a very valuable thing for me in my teaching, is I have my students do academic social tagging. So at the start of the course, I introduce them to DIGO if they don't already know about it. It's a tagging system that's free. I give them a tag, which is the number of the course at Harvard, so T561 or T545. And I say, when you're rummaging around the internet, if you come across something that's related to the course, take 15 seconds and tag it. And then I have a RSS feed that puts the tags right up on the front page of the course site. So 1 minute after they tag something, there it is, part of a list of things that students have found. Over the course of the semester, I get 700 to 1,000 tags that appear. And even though it's my field, 2/3 of those tags were things I didn't know about. So that both illustrates how hard it is to keep up now, but it also says if you're part of a group that's collectively doing environmental scanning, even in a very disorganized way, even without trying to coordinate that at all, you can get a very rich source. Now, of course, our DIGO feed is open, so anybody can come take a look at what some very smart Harvard students are finding and use that as an environmental scanning system. But a lot of teachers have small networks of colleagues that are interested in the same things they are, and I would say set up a little tagging group and just feed for each other the things that you're finding, and you'll be amazed at all the stuff that starts to come across that's of value.
You know, I hope this doesn't break the frame, but Glenn, I think it might be good if you explain what TPACK is, because it came up and probably not everybody knows. I think you're a pretty knowledgeable guy about that.
Well, it's a framework that TPACK stands for Technological Pedagogical Content Knowledge, and it basically is a framework saying that you need the technology, you need the pedagogy, and you need the content, and the good work happens at the intersection of those three. So it's a framework for pulling all those together. There's obviously a lot more to it. If you do a web search, you'll find lots of information. But it's just, we've used it here in professional development work, and it's a good organizer. It helps you kind of put the pieces of this puzzle together and keep track of things. So.
I was going to say, I'm not sure I have much to add. I do feel overwhelmed, too, I must admit. And like Chris, I use a Ning in my class, which is a place where people post and comment on each other's postings, things that look relevant to the class and to me. And that has been a successful filter to me, because things that are good rise to the top for me. But I, too, I have to admit, feel overwhelmed a lot of the time when I'm out on the web.
Good. As we're running into the last few minutes, there's I'm sorry we're not getting to all the questions, but there's one that's come in that I'll add a piece to, which is, as you look to the future of educational technology, what are you most worried about and what are you most excited about?
So I'm worried that our industrial era model of education, or in Harvard's case, the medieval era model of education, may collapse financially before we have a new model that has the public acceptance behind it to replace that. We look at what's happening now with the structural change in the economy. We're not really living through a recession, in my opinion. We're moving through a permanent change in the economy in this country and other countries. And education as a service sector is not going to have the kind of resources that it takes to use expensive human resources inefficiently in the way that the industrial era model does. And so we see larger and larger class sizes. We see more and more jobs eliminated. We see salaries frozen. We see things that are deemed non-essential that many of us think are essential being pared away. And there's no end in sight. So the old model is literally collapsing. And the National Ed Tech Plan talks about a new model, and I think we could do many parts of the new model, but there isn't widespread public awareness, there isn't political will, there isn't the kind of mobilization that it would take to make the leap that our country took a century ago when we did replace an outmoded system, rural one-room schoolhouses, with, at that time, a modern system, the modern system of schooling. So that's the thing that worries me, is all my life I've been hoping that we would finally get past the industrial era schooling system, but the hope was that we would go to something better, not to whatever we're going to end up with if we're not thoughtful about things like the National Ed Tech Plan.
So what I'm frightened about is not unrelated to that, I think. Chris and I are talking about this on the way here. I'm worried about when technology drives, we have a bunch of software engineers who are creating educational stuff, which we actually wouldn't like. And a lot of money is being poured into things that are largely, as someone said, diphthong bombs, and where we're taking the worst of the old pigeon theories and applying them in these gorgeous new technologies. So getting the balance right, so educators are actually driving this rather than people who essentially are software engineers, which we definitely need, but I don't want them driving the pedagogy. So that worries me. Want to say quick things what you like, Chris?
I'm excited actually about what's happening in the developing countries. We're used to thinking of innovation as starting in the developed countries, and particularly in the United States, and then the rest of the world kind of picks up on it. But actually, in terms of 21st century education, the developing countries may well be where we see the first models, because they're never going to have a school every 3 miles and a university every 30 miles. They have enormous demand, but no way of using the standard infrastructure to get to it. And they also don't have a very pervasive system of industrial era schooling that's fighting back against any kind of change, that's resisting any kind of change. So I'm excited because I'm watching what's happening with mobile devices out in the developing world and thinking that there may be some very interesting lessons learned that flow back the other direction into the developed countries.
Cool. I feel the same with kids with special needs, that I think a lot of the revolution is being driven by kids in the margins here in the U.S., where we're actually getting to pedagogy as opposed to information transfer. And one last thing I guess I would like to say I'm excited about is I want to go to your analogy, Chris, the orchestra. I think that technology is allowing us to create orchestras instead of making everybody a violin player. And our standardized ways of doing things when we had textbooks and blackboards, we had to make kids be more the same. So everybody was a violinist or a failed violinist who happened to play tuba. And I think that the technology allows us to make real orchestras, to say we need strong trumpet players and violinists and oboists and whatever, and that will be better for our schools because fewer kids will feel marginalized, but it will be better for the culture when we are developing orchestras rather than all soloists.
Okay. I think that's a great final statement. It's interesting to hear both your worries and what you're excited about. David and Chris, thank you so much. We have a couple of closing things to do, and I'd like to thank all of you who participated. As you can see in front of you, we would appreciate you completing a very quick evaluation of this webinar. It helps us continuously improve what we're doing here. And we have a number of upcoming events you see in front of you, continuing this series of webinars, and there'll always be information about these and others on the EPIC-Ed website, epiced.org. And there also is there's not a hashtag, there's a Twitter community link to follow the discussion. And I believe with that, we are ready to close. Again, thank you all. It's been a very informative and engaging session. Thank you.